Hi everyone, I'm Narayanan.
I'm Shwetha Srikanthan, and we're the hosts of Himal's podcasts. December is nearly over, and 2025 is just around the corner. So today we're bringing you a very special episode where we reflect on what has been an incredible year for us and the rest of the Himal team.
In 2024, we launched a new website, a revamped Himal's patron program, brought you more ambitious stories and great South Asian journalism, improved and expanded our newsletters, and launched 2 new podcasts.
We've also doubled our output of podcasts. From publishing an episode every 2 weeks, we're now publishing a new episode every single week. Now you get even more of the State of Southasia podcast, where South Asia's top minds unpack essential news and events, and the Southasia Review of Books podcast, the place for all things literary in the region.
What the Modi regime has accomplished is it is that valorized hate that has become part of our social life.
And this is what the meaning of my dear Kambola is, and I'm coming from that part of the country, I can tell this is what literature does. It really gives you a doorway into understanding the people and their culture through their own words.
I grew up in the Sri Lanka that was at war with itself, and which in all ways but one, it has never stopped, really.
In Sri Lanka, it is a rejection and also perhaps a change that we see in the public, where they start to ask more questions.
Remember, Hasina did not come to power through a military coup. So she was elected and then she became a despot.
So we want to tell you all about what we've been able to pull off this year and what's in store for Himal in 2025. But Himal's future as an independent magazine is in the hands of listeners like you. By becoming a paying Himal patron today, you can keep Himal's podcast paywall free and open access for everyone in South Asia, and help us bring you more intelligent conversations on the region's politics, culture, and society in 2025 and beyond.
And today we have a very special guest here with us, Himal's editor Roman Gautam, to talk about what 2024 has been like for Himal, what the launching of our podcasts have been like, and what's in store for 2025. So, Roman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Shwetha. Thank you, Nayantara. Good to be on here. I think first time I'm doing a podcast with you guys, which is a great step for us. Yeah, we've made a hell of a lot of progress this year. The year that was for Himal, but I think also the year that was in South Asia, because I think, everything that we've been up to in Himal, as it should be, has always been very closely tied to everything that's been happening in South Asia. And I think that it's been a very momentous year, of course, for us as a small magazine and our small team, but I think just a momentous year in South Asia, one where, South Asia kind of took some pretty historic steps. So yeah, excited to unpack all of that with you guys. And of course, for all of our listeners, I just also want to say to all the listeners who've been with us so far on the podcasts, thank you to all of you who've been tuning in. As Nayantara was saying, we need your support. We need the support of readers like you, because we're an independent magazine. We don't take any outside funding from governments or corporates. We do this for you, and we want to keep doing this for you.
Roman, if you had told me a year ago that I would be hosting a podcast on Himal Southasian, I would not have believed you. But here we are, a year later. We've had about 15 episodes of the State of Southasia and a similar number of the Southasia Review of Books. Remind us all of that moment when we decided to launch these 2 podcasts earlier this year.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that was just in January 2024 that we sat down and were really looking at next steps for Himal as a magazine, but also not just as a text magazine. I think, we had already been doing some experimentation with multimedia, etc. I think in 2023, we really made the effort to speak to a lot of our readers and some of our listeners at that point. We ran a survey, we had calls where, we were speaking to people either in small groups or even one-on-one to really get a sense of what people wanted more of. One thing we kept hearing about was, intelligent conversations, more interviews, but interviews where, people were much more keen on having them in podcast form. So, for us, that was something that was at that point outside of our comfort zone, outside of what we knew how to do. But we took the plunge because our audience was asking for it. And for us, that's the number one reason to take a new bold step, even if it's something that is a little bit nervous making for us if we've not done it before. But yeah, in January, I think both of you will remember, because of course you guys have been on the front lines of it and also behind the scenes. I also want to say a big thank you to Ritika, our audio producer, who's been behind the scenes for all of these episodes. We've basically had to teach ourselves this. I mean, of course, we've had some advice and outside help along the way, but when we first took the plunge, really it was the both of you guys just stepping up and saying, okay, let's try this, right? I mean, Nayantara, I remember conversations where you were also a little bit nervous about it. I mean, I had tried doing a podcast last year and realized that it's more difficult than it seems to run a good conversation. You guys have both just jumped in, learned as you've gone. I think that, the episodes keep getting better and better. And Ritika as well, from just the quality of audio production to just managing things as an audio producer behind the scenes, I think taken things quite far, I think, this year. That's not to say that we're done. And I think we can make a promise to our listeners. I mean, this year we were pushing to get everything to the point where we could be producing one podcast each week. We've gotten there now, and we're going to keep pushing to basically give you better and better conversations.
I'd also like to add that we've had some great training and mentorship from the folks at Puma Podcasts in the Philippines in the middle of this year. They held a workshop for the Himal team, and that was super helpful. And I think we can almost hear the difference in the podcasts from early this year to now.
And Shwetha, you already were doing the Southasia Review of Books in the form of a newsletter, but what was it like to take that into podcast form?
Yeah, so the newsletter we launched in April of 2023 because the question we asked ourselves at that time was, there's a London review of books, there's a New York review of books, but South Asia doesn't have its own review of books. And at the start of this year, we felt like to take it to the next step, to actually have conversations with the authors that we're featuring on the newsletter would be just a great way to expand our community of readers and to just get to know these authors better.
Right. I just want to say again, Roman, I was more than just a little nervous. I came into this with great trepidation, but it's been immense learning and, not just process of producing podcasts, but simply learning about the region from all the guests that we've had on the podcast themselves, whether it's been on the Southasia Review of Books with Shwetha or my guest on the State of Southasia. I think the idea really has been on the State of Southasia to look at a sensible, reasonable way at all the chaos and tumult that has been going on in the region and to keep our listeners best informed of what's been going on. But not just about, current events, but also from time to time to look at a larger picture, more evergreen themes in these specific countries and in the region as a whole.
Yeah, and we've had a pretty crazy year in South Asia as well, especially for you on your podcast on State of Southasia. I think it's been exciting, for us now to also find the really best people to speak to a lot of what's happening in the region. And there's never a boring day in South Asia, I think, with everything happening, so many elections, Manipur, which continues to be a really huge point of concern. It's been a crazy year. And that I just wanted to ask as well, I think maybe in terms of some of the guests and the conversations you've had, are there any ones that really stick out in your mind in terms of the kinds of conversations and the insights that you've been able to bring to the table?
Absolutely. I think for many reasons, will always remember that the first guest on State of Southasia was the filmmaker Anand Patwardhan. And we had him on the podcast because that was the moment when the Ram temple in Ayodhya had just been opened and consecrated with great fanfare, with Modi himself, India's Prime Minister, helming proceedings there. And Anand Patwardhan's film Ram Ke Naam, which was more than 30 years old at that point, was suddenly circulating again on social media. And so we thought it would be a good idea to have him on the podcast. And that was a really illuminating conversation. So the film actually depicts one of the first attacks on the Babri Masjid, not the one that eventually brought it down in December 1992, but an attack prior to that. And he described those moments, those kind of frenzied mobs making their way into Ayodhya, but also about the residents of Ayodhya themselves who didn't really see the need for a new temple to be built there. he talked about caste equations at that point of time. But a great reminder was how the soft peddling of Hindutva by the so-called secular parties in India actually fueled this kind of mania and stoked the whole Ram Janmabhoomi movement, which eventually was led to the rise of the BJP and this moment where Modi is elected as Prime Minister in 2014 and the opening of the Ram Temple in 2024. So that was a good way to start this podcast. On the same theme, just after the election in India in May, I spoke to Harsh Mandar, who is a peace activist in India, and he was also talking about this increase, this normalization, valorization, even incentivization of hate in India, which we really can see through the increased number of lynchings against minorities, especially Muslims in India. Those are the episodes about India that really stood out to me. And I know through this episode, we'll be talking about more that's come out of the podcast. But Shwetha, I want to ask you, you've also heard similar themes on the Books podcast.
So whereas you've heard these conversations about the rise of the right in India, whereas in SARB podcasts, one theme that has kept coming up is the decline of the Indian left. So Siddharth Deb, for example, he talked about how when Modi first came to power, a section of India's mainstream liberal elite were almost willing to turn a blind eye to Modi's undemocratic politics, and we're still seeing echoes of that to this day. So that's been very interesting to see across, not just in India, but across the region. This is also something we've covered in the India election series we did, where we looked at how Modi's return to power and the elections affect the rest of South Asia as well, which you edited, Nayantara. So tell us more about that series.
As this big Indian election was approaching, we were really thinking about how we were going to cover it, because the way Himal looks at elections in the region is quite different from how, media in various countries would cover their own elections, or someone from outside would cover the elections in these countries. And we really wanted to get that regional perspective. Roman, on the larger theme, how did we think about this view of looking at the Indian election from all its neighbors?
I think as editors, we were looking at all the coverage that was already coming out and trying to find what wasn't being said. And I think what we were finding is that, yes, there was international coverage, primarily Anglophone media from the West, or just some of these big global media brands, Al Jazeera, etc. Or, of course, there was deep, specific domestic coverage within India, state level, national level. And of course, that's all very valuable coverage. But I think what we were seeing that was missing was the regional view. Sadly, that's a theme that we see across so much coverage of the subcontinent and of India as well, right? I think that, yes, India is the big country at the heart of South Asia, both geographically, but also, when it comes to power in the region, trade in the region, etc. So it's understandable, of course, that there is such a heavy focus on India. But then to try and see India the way that it looks to its neighbors, I think is something that the world doesn't do enough of. And I think we in the region don't do enough of either. Here we are, Nayantara, you're an Indian national, I'm a Nepali national, we have a Sri Lankan national here with Shwetha. So I think that, we are able to see India from dimensions that are very close to home and I think very revealing, but I think that oftentimes get missed out. And I think that that's kind of what we were going for in the election coverage as well, right? We were trying to tell the world, we named our series Modi's India from the Edges. But again, I think also being careful not to just define things purely based on national borders, which again is, I think, part of how Himal tends to think of the region. Of course, we respect those national borders. They are there. They are a reality of our lives. But it's silly to just stop your inquiry at these national borders. So, of course, we had contributors from the neighboring countries of South Asia talking about how Modi's 10 years at that point in power looked from Bangladesh, from Nepal, etc. But also we had people from the edges of India, meaning the northeast, also the south, specifically Tamil Nadu, and getting really perceptive people in those parts of the country to assess what Modi's rule had meant for them. And I think that the kind of insight that we got, I mean, that series did very well for us, which, of course, is great validation for us. It means that our readers also found value in the questions that we were asking. But I think it built a really unique view of Modi and an assessment of what it has meant both within India and outside of India, but outside the typical questions, right? I mean, outside of the questions of just what's been happening, let's say, in the Hindi heartland.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that it took a lot of work to get people who really knew these countries, knew these regions, to do this kind of deep analysis of what these 10 years of Modi had meant in those particular parts of South Asia. And some of the stories turned out to be pretty prescient. Roman, you mentioned Manipur and, Make Peace, It Lose Peace back in May, really talked about how BJP's 10 years had created so much more division within the Northeast. Of course, the Manipur conflict had already been raging for about a year at that point. But I think as we go on, that piece just drives home the point even more.
One more thing to add there, I think, when you were talking about prescient articles in that series, I think the view from Bangladesh also was raising red flags for New Delhi that at the time it didn't want to look at, because Sheikh Hasina was still very safely ensconced in Dhaka in power. And at the time, New Delhi had basically backed Sheikh Hasina steamrolling her way through another election, a sham election, as I think we had also reported. We carried a lot of coverage on Bangladesh this year as well. But of course, for New Delhi, their candidate in Dhaka had secured another term in power, and that's all that mattered. But of course, now we know that there was so much simmering under the surface in Bangladesh. And I think our piece in that series was raising a lot of those questions and raising the questions of how much discomfort there was brewing in Dhaka vis-a-vis India. And of course, this year, all of that really came to the fore.
So we've talked about the Indian election, but this really has been a year of elections across South Asia that all started with the Bangladesh election that happened in January. Let's talk about what that's been like for Himal, covering this year of elections.
Yeah, both for Himal and I think also for South Asia, right? What has this year of elections meant? And I mean, it's a lot of elections. With the change of years, Bhutan had just completed an election from December 23 into January 24. So some political changes there. But I think that the big elections, and there were a lot of them this year, of course, India. I think for some people, a surprise that Modi had to form a coalition at the end of that election. The widespread expectation was that he would be winning certainly more dominantly than he did. So I think there was that. But the Bangladesh election, of course, that was one that raised a lot of questions and a lot of red flags about what was happening, both in terms of Hasina's position within Bangladesh and how she had become so autocratic, but also about New Delhi's backing. And then, of course, you had Pakistan, where, again, things did not quite go according to script for, I think, the powers in Pakistan. The ideal plan, I think, there would have been for Imran Khan just to have become a non-player. But of course, he refuses to go away, and the PTI refuses to go away. And I think for the Pakistani establishment, that's been a very difficult thing to manage. And of course, momentous elections, two of them. I mean, first a presidential election and then a parliamentary election in Sri Lanka as well. I mean, of course, there was the Argalaya, the popular uprising a couple of years ago. And now with these elections where the old powers have been very thoroughly voted out, both from the presidential office and also from the parliament. And in the political history of Sri Lanka, I think a hugely pivotal year. Of course, remains to be seen how well the new government does in terms of delivering on all of the promises and expectations. But I think, looking at all of these elections together, I think that there's a few things that really stand out. I remember somebody had talked about it as kind of maybe South Asia's Arab Spring. And, to explain why, in Bangladesh, I think it's clear, right? You had a popular revolution deposing an autocrat. In Sri Lanka, also, I think that, again, it wasn't this year that the uprising happened, but this is the completion of a process that began with a popular uprising against a government that had just lost all sense of right and all moral authority to rule over the country. And I think in Pakistan, what we are witnessing right now is also, in essence, a popular revolt against the powers that be. I mean, I think that the depth of the frustration in Pakistan is clear in how the PTI I would say wasn't able to deliver on a lot of the expectations and promises when it was in power. But regardless, it is still seen as the anti-establishment party. And that's a huge part of why so many people are rallying to Imran Khan's cause. So I think that, in all these places, you have clearly this exasperation with the establishment and a deep, deep seated sense that things can be better and things need to be better and that you need to change things around in terms of your politics. In Pakistan, of course, that process is being stymied. We know that the Pakistan election was also far from free in a really meaningful way. In Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina thought that she had got away with it by basically running an election just for show, I think we can say, right? In Sri Lanka, the election results speak for themselves. But I think also it goes beyond that, right? And I think that that's kind of where I think this idea of perhaps something like a slow burn South Asian spring, if we can call it that, maybe that's what's happening, right? I think that that's one way of reading what's happening in the region. I have concerns with calling it something like the South Asian Arab Spring, primarily because we know how the Arab Spring turned out. And I think that that's where we really need to be thinking carefully now as a region and as individuals in each of our different countries and polities.
Absolutely. And I think what happened in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh has also been a good reminder that South Asia is not a stranger to revolutions and that its people, despite the efforts of states and I would say mostly violent efforts, that the people are not hesitant to make their will known by whatever means necessary. So I think that was a really key moment this year.
To just talk about the podcasts again, I think I'm very glad that, again, we've had these guests that have been very balanced in their views of what's been going on, not people who are just caught up with kind of the mainstream narrative or with the mood. So, for instance, while talking about the Sri Lanka elections, we had Ambika Satkunanathan on that episode, who was really talking about that moment, the result of the presidential election when Dissanayaka comes to power as a break from the past. A lot of people in Sri Lanka were looking at it as a break from the past, but she also reminded us that there were people who had a lot of this class consciousness, who were not very happy that maybe he would, the more elite classes were a little suspicious of his presidency, while a lot of other people were almost ecstatic that he had come to power. Similarly for Bangladesh, right? We had Jyoti Rahman, who is an economist and political commentator, a few months after the interim government took over. Since the revolution and even to this day, there's a lot of talk about Islamist forces behind the revolution, or about the interim government being propped up by the military, and this is actually a coup. And Jyoti Rahman debunks all those theories, talking about how this really was the will of the people, and that way there is a lot of hope and optimism in Bangladesh, even if the road ahead is very difficult to kind of rebuild the country from what the Awami League had done for them. So at the end of this year, if you want to kind of have a reminder of what it's been like, do go back and listen to those episodes, because we've had these really clear-eyed guests talking about them.
So we've been talking about where the eyes of South Asia and the world has mostly been locked on, which is Bangladesh mostly and India. But at Himal, we have also covered the places where attention has dropped off in the last few years. In the 3 years since the return to power, the Taliban have excluded women and girls from almost every aspect of public life, and they've continued to roll out all kinds of restrictions on women, denying them access to education, employment, even showing their faces outside their homes. And it was really great to talk about some of these experiences from women from Afghanistan in one episode of the Southasia Review of Books podcast, where we spoke about collective diary of 21 women from Afghanistan, writers, that they had compiled right after the fall of Kabul in 2021. And Nayantara, you've also recorded a conversation with Kate Clark about what's happening in Afghanistan as well. Tell us more about that.
You're right, Shwetha, because it's just been so difficult. I think for everyone, it's been difficult for information to come out of the country, apart from, the diktats that the Taliban themselves are announcing and the reactions to that. So I think there is a bit of an information black hole there. We don't know quite what's going on, but we know it can't be very good. But I think we understand, maybe not to the full extent, but we understand the plight of women, but also that the country's economy is in tatters, right? And they're really suffering through, I think, one of the worst times in their histories. And again, I think that is what that conversation with Kate Clark was all about. It's politically, the economy, human rights, everything is just not going well in Afghanistan right now.
And speaking of stories that aren't getting mainstream attention, and also using our resources and our editorial choices at Himal to make sure we're digging beyond just the obvious headlines. That's also been such a theme for us. I mean, even in, of course, Afghanistan is one place. I think even within Pakistan, what's happening in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, for example, the kinds of sectarian violence that you're seeing, what's happening now with the Pashtun movement, which I think remains an underreported but still very big story when it comes to what the future might hold in Pakistan. Also, just a lot of our in-depth work, I think this year we've done investigations, of course, again, with limited resources. There's only so many we can do. We did a big investigation early in the year on Bantara, which is the wildlife project that's being run by, in essence, the Reliance Group in India, and by specifically the Ambani family that controls the corporation. Lots of really uncomfortable revelations and questions about how this massive wildlife project situated in the world's largest petrochemical refinery complex of all places in Gujarat is sourcing animals and has been able to amass a huge and growing collection of wildlife, even amid some quite strict wildlife laws, which are also changing simultaneously in India. That's definitely been a highlight of the year for us, I think. To be able to do an investigation like that and to bring to the public realm information that otherwise wasn't coming out. And I think that that's also, a reflection of what we can do as an independent magazine, because I know that within India, getting any information out on anything to do with Reliance is extremely difficult in the media. A large part of the reason for that is that Reliance owns so much of the mainstream media in the country. But even where there is no formal ownership, I know this as somebody who has worked as a journalist in India for more than a decade now. It is enormously difficult to even find, non-Reliance owned or controlled media houses that will be willing to publish any investigation, any reporting that shows the family and the corporation in anything except the most positive light. So I think that that's been a big part of what we've done. I mean, of course, that's not the only investigation. We also just not so long ago published an investigation into massive use of pesticides, the massive and again underreported problem of pesticide residues in Indian spices. But that, of course, is linked to just pesticide overuse in many parts of agricultural production in India. So I think there's lots of places like that where we've been able to look at stories that are not part of the mainstream focus, but still deserve a lot of attention.
Roman, we also did a couple of long-form profiles, which were very interesting. You want to tell us about those?
Absolutely. We were talking about the Sri Lankan election, right? The presidential election, which brought AKD, as he is known, Dissanayake, to power. And of course, the person that he kicked out of office was Ranil. I think, we profiled him because after the Aragalaya, the popular uprising, Sri Lanka's transition out of that in many ways was defined by this one person. And I think that that's what we were trying to understand as that election approached. And we published that profile of Ranil right on the eve of the election. We were trying to understand, where does Sri Lanka stand now? And trying to tell that story through Ranil and his political career, a checkered political career by all means. I think, if you read the profile, it's been oftentimes a case of him succeeding almost despite himself. It's a record of a lot of failures, and he was possibly the most unlikely person. And I think, he was literally the last person that the job was offered to. When Gotabaya Rajapaksa had to step down, and Sri Lanka was trying to figure out who next. Also a deeply unpopular president, right? I think that both the opinion polls before the election, but then also the election results have borne that out. So a very deeply unpopular figure in Sri Lanka, somebody seen in especially the popular mind as continuing a lot of the worst parts of the old political system. I think what that piece brought out is the ways that as much as Ranil was unpopular, and it's clear that he was not going to be the next president, and people voted him out, he lay the ground for what I think most people would agree has been the fairest and freest Sri Lankan election in living memory. That's not to deny that he's been enmeshed, certainly, in the political system. And yes, in the past has also been linked to the family, the Rajapaksas, in various ways through his own political career. And the piece brings all of that out. But I think that in many ways, the humbling of the Rajapaksas in this election, Sri Lanka has emerged in a place where it seems, you can never say anything with complete certainty, but it seems like Sri Lanka has closed the door on the Rajapaksas and that entire chapter of its history. And the other memorable political profile that we did is of C.K. Raut. I think a name that is not very familiar to people outside of Nepal, but I think within Nepal, a lot of people recognize him. He is a leader from the Madhes of Nepal, one of the most marginalized regions in the country, and also has a very interesting and very complex political trajectory, going from somebody who was, in essence, a separatist leader asking for a separate Madhes to now having joined the parliament in Kathmandu and trying through party politics to deliver on some of the same promises of justice and equality to people in the Madhes. And again, I think, long-form profile, a very well-written, that I think will have a massive shelf life. I think that, one of the things, again, that we as Himal can do that maybe, media that is under pressure to move only on the daily news cycle is not able to do. We can look at long-term trends. And I'm very convinced that the future of the Madhes, which has been one of the regions that's been most hard done by the Nepali state historically, I think that is a barometer of the health of politics and democracy in Nepal. And I think that this is hardly the last we've heard of the Madhesi people and their political aspirations. And in the figure of C.K. Raut, again, we spotted an opportunity to tell this larger story through the story of a very complex and compelling character. So again, I think, for any of the readers out there, whether you're from Nepal and want to have a closer read on what's been happening in the Madhes and how the entire history of the Madhes has panned out, that's a great read. For anybody on the outside, anyone who's a longer term watcher of South Asia, I think that that's a piece you should read, because I think that story is going to remain part of the picture in South Asia for certainly years and probably decades to come.
Yeah, there was certainly a great piece of nonfiction, but a very similar theme that we also, featured a work of fiction, and that was on the Books podcast. Shwetha, you want to tell us about Smriti Ravindra's book?
Yeah, of course. Smriti Ravindra is a Nepali Indian writer, and her debut novel, The Woman Who Climbed Trees, it also talks about the Madhesi experience in Nepal, particularly that of women. And I think it's also a long ignored topic, not just in nonfiction, but also in Nepali literature. And we talked about that in detail in that conversation. And this is also something that we hope to take a closer look at through book reviews in the coming years. So stay tuned for that.
And again, a reminder to our listeners that not everything we do at Himal is super serious. We have a piece about Shah Rukh Khan that went up earlier this year in January. And we just published a piece on cricket about India and Australia playing each other and what it means for those two cricketing cultures. But Shwetha, I'd like to ask you about one of the fun things that's come out of books in South Asia in 2024, and that's the rise of science fiction, right?
Absolutely. It's been a huge year for science fiction in South Asia, and I think a huge part of that is the success of the Colombo-based writer Vajra Chandrasekhara, who we also had invited as a guest on the Southasia Review of Books podcast. He's taken home many, many awards for his 2 new books this year. And in the conversation, he talks about, while it seems like the surge in science fiction is a new one, these writers have been writing for many, many years. But now that the attention is coming to them, that he hopes that people will be paying more attention to the amazing science fiction and speculative fiction coming out of the region. And he recommends at least 10 excellent new books that have come out this year. So definitely check that out as well.
And I also want to say, I mean, yeah, I think that that's so much part of what makes working at Himal and working for our audience such privilege and also so fun. I mean, of course, we're dealing with a lot of heavy questions. It's not all politics. It's not all doom and gloom. I think that, we've always taken culture coverage also very seriously because I think that is so important to our daily lives in South Asia and for anybody trying to understand the region. It's been so good to also see just how well our readership has responded to the Southasia Review of Books newsletter. And for any of you listening who are not already signed up, you can go to our website and sign up for those for our newsletters, including the Southasia Review of Books. I think that we're seeing that clearly there is a thirst among South Asians and South Asia watchers for views on the region in terms of all the cultural production, whether it's films and books, but really to have South Asian eyes on South Asia. And of course, Himal's definition of South Asian is, again, not strictly nation state based. I think that, so much of our understanding of the region and also the coverage of our own cultures is mediated through the lens of outside institutions. And I think we've just seen how much people have been hankering for South Asians looking at South Asia and talking to each other about how we make sense of our own region. I thank you to all those of you who've been listening to the podcast and already subscribing to the newsletter. We take that as encouragement and we're going to keep doing more of it.
Absolutely. And we do have a very exciting new Southasia Review of Books project coming in the new year. So very excited to share more about this in January.
Yeah, Shwetha, you were mentioning stuff that's coming ahead, coming in January, and I think that we've done some introspection and thinking and looking back at the year that was, but also, of course, we're looking ahead at what lies ahead, I think, both for Himal and for South Asia. I mean, we recently carried a piece on Maharashtra where in a state election, voters were left to choose just between two different types or two different brands of Hindutva. So I think, just how deeply Hindutva has seeped into the political and cultural fabric of India and the real transformation of India, which is an ongoing process, but I think one that's hardly stopped just because Modi got fewer parliamentary seats. And I think that that's something to watch. And I think that, the question of India in the region, I think, will continue to be huge. I think that, the way that we were looking at India from the outside and trying to understand it with the eyes of people who look at it from the region and ask questions that maybe people in New Delhi might not ask, or even people in some of the global centers of power, in the West might not ask. I think a lot of that is going to be very, very important. I think that, there's the question of Adani, which is huge in the region, right? I think that people are waking up to that, of course, with the Hindenburg report last year, and now with legal action against Adani in the US. But again, we in the region could have flagged these things much earlier. I think that in Bangladesh, there's the question of what happens now with power agreement with Adani that raised a lot of questions when it was signed and now is facing renewed scrutiny. In Sri Lanka, you have a new government that has said that it will also look anew at another highly controversial wind power deal with Adani. I think Adani's footprint across the region has been tied very closely to the Indian government's footprint across the region. So I think all of this will continue to be a big question, domestically in India with Hindutva, but also in terms of the future of regionalism for us as South Asians, and also just the individual fates of our own countries and the kinds of links that we do want to see, where it's fair links and advantageous links between different countries of the region. I think that what happens with Adani, and I think, Adani's now very central place in Indian regional diplomacy, I think these are all things that we will be trying to keep an eye on going forward.
So, Roman, we'll be taking big steps in some new directions in 2025. We're now at work on a geofenced paywall, for example, that will restrict access to Himal's content for readers outside South Asia. But this was not an easy decision. Tell us more about this.
I think that that's an important thing to talk about for us when we're thinking about what next for Himal. So, to give our readers some context, you will all already be aware that we are fully independent. We don't take any government money or corporate money. We don't take anything that would in any way compromise our editorial independence. And of course, that means that we more and more have to lean on our readers, because I think that, we are doing this for you as our audience, as our readers and listeners. And if we can close that circle by getting our readers to support our journalism by becoming paying supporters, then that really is the ideal arrangement that guarantees both our survival and our independence long term. Of course, we've taken a big step in 2024 by launching our revamped patron program, which allows our readers and listeners to become paying supporters of Himal. We've gotten a small but very dedicated group of allies who have become paying patrons. And I want to take this chance to say a big, big thank you to all of them, because both in terms of monetary support, but also what their support means to us in terms of morale and purpose, I think that it's such a huge boost. Every single one of you, thank you so much for your support. What we've learned from this year is that it's hard to convince a large enough segment of readers to come on board and support our journalism, and that we need to think of different ways of doing it. So this year, all of our content has been entirely open access, and we've just been asking people who see the value of the work to come and support us by becoming paying patrons. After a lot of research, conversations, and soul searching, next year, what we're going to do is roll out this geo-fenced paywall. What that will mean is that our content will be behind a paywall outside of South Asia, where from a lot of conversations, we know that people's ability to pay is higher. And I should explain that within South Asia, we've had lots of people who reach out to us and say, I really want to support you, but this is not affordable for me, because of course the financial realities in South Asia are very different. A large part of our readership is young people and students in South Asia for whom paying for media is something unaffordable. We've also had lots of people reaching out saying, I want to pay, but I don't have the ability to pay, meaning within South Asia, we don't have cross-border payment infrastructure that's integrated across the whole region. A lot of people sitting in, let's say, Dhaka will not be able to pay or, have the infrastructural ability, let's say, to pay us to support our work, because we are based in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And, we found that the best way forward for us is probably to go behind a geo-fenced paywall, where we restrict access to our content in the West and in the world outside of South Asia. And we ask people to pay to access that content, because we are confident that our work is valuable enough for people to want to pay for it. And also we will tell them that is going to support our mission of making sure that within South Asia, we continue to provide high quality, independent journalism to everybody. So to be very clear, what we are not doing is going behind a paywall in South Asia per se.
And just to add that for those who can't become patrons today, you can always help us spread the word by sharing Himal's work, forwarding our newsletters and podcasts. And everyone is welcome, every new reader, every listener, and we're grateful for anything you can do to help us.
Yes, and for any of you who are in a position and to support independent journalism by becoming paying allies of the magazine, please do so. Every little bit of help really, really counts. It means a lot to us. There will be links to our support page in the episode notes here as well, or you can just go to our website at himalmag.com. Please become patrons. It means a lot. We rely on you to continue doing good journalism in South Asia and on South Asia.
And we have a lot in the works for 2025 at Himal, and we can't wait to share it with you. And as we're heading into the end of the year, we'll be taking a short break from the podcasts, and we'll be back with you in the new year on 6th of Jan with a new SARB episode. So see you on the other side.
Thank you guys for having me on the show, and to all of our readers, happy 2025. We'll see you in the new year.
And this episode, as always, was edited by Ritika Chauhan. Keep reading and listening to Himal, and we'll be back with new podcasts in the new year. See you then.